So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Gabriel, and together with Pontus, I help run this meetup. So you've hopefully seen me once or twice before. I'm also partner at a Swedish IT consultancy in Stockholm called Arison. And so if you're in Stockholm and interested in being a consultant, please do reach out to me. So I'm now interfering with Ulrich's Gothenburg recruitment. I've been in the Reason community for not super long, but maybe 2 years now or something like that. And I'm primarily a front-end developer, although I've done some backend as well, or full stack. Or yeah, I like to kind of at least understand a bit about the entire stack. And I'm also very I enjoy the data layer, which is fun, which has also led me to things like GraphQL and Relay. And Relay itself, I've been using that in at various capacities in production for like 4 or 5 years now. I started very briefly with the first iteration of Relay, which doesn't exist anymore. And then at my last job, we used Relay exclusively for the data layer. And I'm a big Relay fan, and I'm also a big fan of Reason. So that led me to start building something called ReasonRelay, which is it's bindings from Relay to Reason, but it's only bindings for the new bleeding edge experimental APIs that Relay is working on, which are fully like hooks based. And this whole thing's going to be a demo, so I'll show you all of it very soon. So what I want to do here is I've prepared a small application, very small, but that contains kind of a lot of the common like patterns that you'd have. So it has routing and it has a few other things like you're likely to see in Relay apps. And what we'll do is we'll click through this app and then it has a built-in mechanism to like artificially slow down the server. So we'll see how it looks when going around without any delay, and then when going around the app with some artificial delay in there. So we can really see like the loading states and things like that. And what we'll do is we'll look at the app, and we'll also, exactly, Reason Delay is the new project name. But we'll look through the code, but then we'll try and, as I try and explain what Suspense and Concurrent Mode in React is, we'll try and see how we can like optimize the app UX using Suspense and Concurrent Mode kind of live. So we'll see how this goes. I really hope the demo devil isn't too close now. I'm risking it all on one card here. So yeah, like I said, just ask questions for everything. There are so many concepts going around here now that's going to be hard for me to know even what end to start in and how to explain things. So my hope is
interrupt you. Yes, like I just did, like from the chat, if people don't want to use their mouth to talk.
Yeah,
if you want
sure.
A bit more like just intense. Or...
Yes, please just interrupt whenever. It's maybe not in mid-sentence.
Yeah, but I'm trying to be a little bit
extremely obvious,
more aggressive than before.
Yeah, be aggressive. I like when Pontus is aggressive.
Okay.
Nice. So
okay.
So I'll start by I'll share my screen, and I'm not a very what do you say? I'm not a very good screen sharer, so I don't have 2 screens. I'm just going to share whatever ways that I see. So I think I'm going to just close these things down, although I like to see I have this one over here. That should be good. So I'd like to see faces at the same time. And Pontus, you'll keep track of the chat, so I don't have to have that open. Okay, so this is the application. It's a kind of just a typical dashboard kind of thing here. There's nothing in the menu except for the dashboard, but you can click yourself up here, which will navigate to the viewer profile, so the logged in user's profile. Here we have a friend list, which we can paginate. and you can jump to users here, other users, and at the other users profile page, we have some tasks, and you can jump into the tasks here as well. And this is looking fine when running at a very expensive MacBook Pro locally with no real database, all in memory in a small node process. But if we redo this and we add some slowdown, we can see that we first get a loading state there, and then we get a loading state there, and then we see our content. And then if we navigate here, same thing here, we get a loading state, we wait for a while, same thing here, we get a loading state, jump over to this user, we get a loading state. Yeah, but still pretty acceptable. But if we refresh this and we add lots of slowdown, you see that this is taking a while to show the skeleton around everything, or it's taking a while to show the dashboard itself. Same here when we navigate, taking quite a while. The same thing when we go here, taking quite a while. We just see this kind of loading indicator thingy a lot. And the same thing when we go here. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Suspense and Concurrent Mode to kind of give us more control over the loading states in our UI and our UI overall. And that's really what like Suspense and Concurrent Mode is all about. It's about giving you like first-class control over your components in a way that isn't intrusive, which is what I've, oh, sorry. Now you get to see me live here when I admit people into the presentation.
And Suspense and Concurrent Mode, that's for React, right? It's not for Relay itself.
Sorry, yeah.
It's an experimental or soon to be done thing for React.
Exactly. So the background is Suspense and Concurrent Mode is experimental React features. They aren't released in a stable version yet. A version of Suspense is available in the stable React release. And it enables, if you know about like React.lazy, which is a way of asynchronously loading components, for instance. So that's available in the stable release. But other than that, both Concurrent Mode and Suspense are fully experimental. And a Concurrent Mode especially has a lot of buy-in. So you probably can't just turn on Concurrent Mode and expect things to work the first time you try it. But just to like separate these two, like Suspense is about adding a first-class way of basically marking things as loading, marking components as loading inside of React. So what happens is the render function runs for the entire tree, and then some component somewhere says that, okay, I'm loading, and that's called that it's suspending. And this suspension event, kind of an event, I don't know if it's, yeah, that's probably not the right terminology, but you can think of it as an event, that then walks up the tree until something catches it. And what catches it is a suspense boundary. And with the suspense boundary, you're like in control of showing a loading state. So as a suspense event is captured, you can either show a loading state or show nothing at all. The idea here is that things can start loading at the same time in different parts of the UI, and that can then bubble up, and you decide where you catch that. Like using a component as suspense, in one case, maybe you want it to show a loading state together with other components or much higher up the tree, and then when you use it in another place in your UI, you want to show a loading state in like a much more refined place, for instance. So like before I go into concurrent mode, are there any questions about Suspense? I guess all of you have already read all of the cool tech blogs, so you know all about it.
But I guess you could say it's kind of the same idea like error boundaries, but you define a boundary that catches something. In this case, not errors, it's loading instead.
It's the exact same thing as error boundaries, only for loading instead of errors. Exactly. The error boundaries has the same kind of effect, that you can wait for an error to bubble as far up as you want and then catch it or them together, kind of.
That's basically to, instead of destroying the whole React tree, you can just catch the error, represent the error as another component instead.
Exactly. So moving on to concurrent mode, which is a bit more difficult to explain, and I'm by no means an expert on concurrent mode, obviously. But the way I understand it is rendering in React currently, like when you render your tree, is always blocking. So it always has to finish rendering. If you start rendering and the rendering is very expensive, you're going to have to wait for it to be done, regardless of how you or what you do. In concurrent mode, React has kind of learned how to interrupt rendering. So React can start and pause and then throw away and restart rendering. And it can also do this off screen. I don't know, it's not really off screen, but I guess it's a way of saying it, which means that React can give you a choice of waiting for an entire tree to finish loading, for instance, before you show it to the user. And this either wasn't possible or was extremely hard before concurrent mode, because you'd have, if you'd want to control loading from a ton of different components, you'd have to handle that kind of internally inside of those components, or build your own system that kind of coordinates loading. So concurrent mode together with Suspense gives you a lot of tools to, again, like control the user experience of when you want to show things to the user, when you want loading states to appear. And so that's the kind of quick rundown of Suspense and concurrent mode. I'm sure there are tons of other things to say about it as well. Then the relation to Relay. So if we start with Relay, which I'm sure not everyone has heard of, Relay is a graphical framework from Facebook. A very fun thing is that Relay, Suspense, and concurrent mode is powering the new Facebook.com fully. So it's in production and being used by, I guess, billions of users already, because I think most people have the new Facebook.com turned on by now. So when I say this is really like everything's bleeding edge and experimental, it is, but it's still being used by, I guess, more people than the average framework. Anyway, so it's still like it's a lot of testing and a lot of thought has gone into this. And Relay, yeah, like I said, it's a graphical client. It's a bit different to it's in the same like category as Apollo or Urkel, but it's usually a bit different to the other frameworks around. Relay like values scalability and performance a ton, and Relay has like a lot of opinions on, well, most things, but like a lot of opinions. And that's a thing that is, I guess, quite different to the other frameworks. The other frameworks are pretty much like, well, not most of them are fairly general purpose and very flexible, and Relay is also flexible in its own kind of way, but it's also full of opinions. And there's so much to say about Relay that I'm not going to go too in depth into Relay. The one thing I want to highlight before we jump into code is that Relay premieres using a concept in GraphQL called fragments, which I'm sure maybe most who've done GraphQL are familiar with. But fragments are a way to define like reusable selections on GraphQL types. So it's a way of just creating reusable material for your queries, more or less. And yeah, so I guess we'll stop there, and then we'll jump into the code zone, and I'll try and like explain as we go along here. Are there any questions before we jump in here? No questions? Excellent. So actually, before...
Sorry, that's one thing that I thought about like 3 minutes ago when you talked about it. I can't be the only one that has ever written a this.state.loading in a component. And it gets kind of messy when you have multiple components, and yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll get into the like main benefits I feel Suspense has, but a lot of the previous like way of doing things is it encourages you to mix handling loading states with your actual like product code, and it gets messy like really quick, especially when you have your top level, like the data that comes into the component can be either is nullable kind of, so you have to always handle that the data maybe doesn't exist. So you need like you litter your code with a ton of handling things that maybe shouldn't be handled that way. Yeah. So before I jump into this, I just want to highlight a few things. We're going to see this in code soon, but up here we have a counter that's telling us how many tasks are currently open, or yeah, I haven't really decided what it means, but we have 7 tasks. You can see this down here as well, together with a small kind of together with a small kind of trend indicator here. These are some like imaginary stats. All of these come separate, so they are separate things. And up here we also have showing the logged in user, so the avatar and the name, which is very creative of the logged in user. So the thing I want to highlight here is we have a nav bar, like the skeleton of the app, and that contains data that we need before we can show it. So we have a main query. If I stop this screen here, do some slow down. You can see we're making 2 queries here. We're making one query for the, I'll show you in the code later, but we're making one query for the dashboard page, and then we're making one query for the nav bar page. And a lot of the things with Relay, you're encouraged to use fragments as much as you can, which means that it'll be much easier for you to combine together a single query for your entire view. In this case, it's pretty common to divide, so you have one separate query for this part that's not going to change much over the lifetime of the app, and then you have a distinct query for each view, kind of. But there's no rule in Relay saying that you have to have a single query for a single view or anything like that. It's more a convention or a recommendation, I guess. There's a few things I want to highlight here before I start digging into the code. I'm using speaking of bleeding edge and experimental stuff, I'm using an unreleased version of ReasonRelay. I'm using a pretty buggy, but soon to be hopefully good dedicated VS Code extension for ReasonRelay that I'm working on. It provides me with a few things I'll show you later on. There's also a router in here that I've ported from an example app that the Relay team has put out for how to use like Suspense and Concurrent Mode. This router is something that I'm hoping to integrate as a first-class member of or part of ReasonRelay. But currently, this is just more of an experiment. But I'll show you just briefly how we have a provider here that I'm passing some routes. I'll show you how the routes look. Just briefly, like I said, this is nothing that's determined that this is the way it's going to look, but currently this is the way it looks. So we're creating a router here. We're passing it routes, and a route looks like this. You get to provide it with a function that takes a match URL. Sorry, here it takes a URL that comes from the Reason React router, and then you get to match on that URL however you want. And then you return either some variables that you want to use or none. And this is the way you say if the route matches or not. The thing you return here, not currently, like here I'm just returning a string, but this could be anything. It could be a tuple or a record or anything. It gets fed into prepare. And in prepare, if you have things you want to prepare before this route loads, you get to do it here. So the typical thing you do here is I'm preloading a query. I know we're going to the task view query, the task view component. And Relay lets me start loading this query as soon as possible. This means that using this, I can start loading the query, the data for the view, as soon as I hover over the link, for instance, or as soon as I press the link. So on mouse down, for instance. This will give me a preload token, is what it's called. In ReasonRelay, it's not called that in normal relay, so I'm probably going to change that. But and I'll pass that into this view, and I'll show you how that's used then later on. But this is like the premise of the router I'll be using here. And this is for a couple of reasons. So here I'm only preloading code. I'm only preloading data, but I could just as easily have this component be fully dynamic, and I need to import the code for this component as well. Having this approach lets me import the code for this component while starting to load the data before the component code is actually loaded, which contains the kind of query probably. So this is called this pattern is called render as you fetch, and it's the relay team has talked about it a lot, and it's a pretty important thing because this means that even if I have a tree here of components that are all dynamically loaded, I can start loading my data as soon as possible, so that maybe when this component, the code for this component completes loading, the data will also be loaded already. And that gives you a lot of flexibility.
We have a question.
Yes.
We have Ulrich escaped the Zoom call, but he joined YouTube chat. And he asked, have you thought about using the routes library that I use in Morph? And then he said, I guess you don't really care about what router the end user will use.
So I have thought about that. I think it looks really nice. I have a user that's contributed to ReasonRelay that's been experimenting with that too, or at least thinking about it. I think it looks like, I could for sure look at that. I think like this is maybe more, people maybe recognize this more from the BuckleScript world, but like I don't really mind. It would be really cool to do that type of thing. The thing the thing I want to preserve in this router, and why this thing isn't just a giant switch statement of all my routes, which is because we can look at the user around here. I'm doing basically the same thing. I'm just extracting the user ID, loading that query instead. Same up here. I'm loading, the reason that these are distinct is because as this thing grows, you want to be able to dynamically add routes as you load more code, kind of. So you want to be able to start with a kind of flat top level route stack, and then as you load, maybe this view has 10 subroutes, and then you load that the code for those views dynamically as you load the view itself, kind of. But no, I think it would be really intriguing to have a look at the library that Ulrich is using and see if that can be fit into this for sure. So and in general, like if you see this and you feel like you have a ton of ideas how this could be much better or done in another way, please reach out and like open an issue on the GitHub or something. This is very experimental at this point, like everything else, but it would be nice to get a group of people together to discuss these things and find a good way forward, because I think it has a lot of value to ship a web router, for instance, that supports concurrent mode and suspense.
And it got me thinking as well, you said that it's BuckleScript people might be more used to this. And also I believe routes, as we saw, like heavily uses custom infix operators. And we won't be able to, as of now at least, in 8.1, we are kind of not allowed to use them. Is that correct?
I think it's, except the new syntax. Yeah, the new syntax has, I don't think you're allowed to use custom infix operators. It's also custom infix operators. For me, it's, I like them, but it's a huge step coming from like a JS background or TypeScript background only. It's a whole new thing that you can redefine operators, and then that so it takes a shift in mindset, which
I mean, we're not here to discuss that with the BuckleScript 8.1. I just noted that it's not just
but to summarize and answer Ulrich's question, yes, sounds like a great idea. Let's talk. Yeah, so this is the router, and the implementation of it. I'm gonna show that like briefly later on because I need to change the thing to show you suspense thing. But we'll start by going to we'll go back to main here. This is the outlet, like the route renderer. So and this is very like suspensey. Here's it gives you a few things that you can supply it with to handle different cases. So for instance, if a route doesn't match, you can render what you want to render if nothing matches. Then you also have render fallback, and this is the thing that's going to be rendered by suspense if nothing else catches the suspension event from the route. That's a lot of words, but it's basically the fallback for the entire router. So if nothing else catches the suspension event in a route, this thing is going to show. And this is just the content of it that you saw. Render
so just
pending.
For clarification, would that be like the top boundary? We're talking about boundaries before, yeah. So that's the catch-all boundary. Yeah.
The catch-all, it's a catch-all boundary for the router. So here's over here is the nav bar, and this in turn has a catch-all up here in the index file where we render. So this is the catch-all kind of thing. Yeah, so it's a bit like, yeah, we'll see. It's a lot of things to keep track of. But render pending, this is going to be a bit useless to explain now, so I'll wait with this. But basically, this means that when React is preparing a new render using Suspense and Concurrent Mode, you're allowed to render something just to show the user that something's going on. And I'll show you this briefly, how it looks in practice. And then Suspense Timeout. I've set this to 10 milliseconds right now, just because I want to mimic, when we start out, I just want to mimic how things usually work. But Suspense Timeout is the timeout that you're allowing React to take to wait for the new content to render off screen before presenting a loading indicator, kind of. So this is going to be pretty abstract. So we'll just go ahead and show this by starting to, we'll change this to 2 seconds. You're allowed to wait for 2 seconds, and then we'll go back in here. Here, are we compiling?
Just a follow-up from Ulrich while we're waiting for the compiler. He said you can still use reason parenthesis proper with BuckleScript. And he says, I don't think it makes sense to make it mandatory in ReasonRelay probably, but it's very performant and nice. Smiley face.
And I think it's a good idea to look at how you could let the user plug something other into the router itself if they want to. So let's see if this works. Now when I press this, you can see that I get a pending state up here, and then it transitions to the route. So the old behavior, if we go back, the normal behavior now without suspense and concurrent mode is that I press here, it directly transitions to the new route, shows a loading indicator briefly, and then shows the content. So that's the way you usually do things. You transition to the route starts loading the data, and then it emits a loading state, and then you handle that loading state, show a loading indicator, and then as soon as the data comes in, you show that data. Here instead, if we go back to, let's change this to, take 2 seconds again here. It's good. This artificial slowdown is interesting. When we start doing things in lots of slowdown later on, we're going to do a lot of waiting. Yeah, okay, so let's try it again. We click this, we get a pending state, and then it transitions as soon as the data has come back and React has rendered it. So this is a way of controlling the UX. So the idea here is that instead of transitioning somebody to a route with a loading indicator, we let them remain on the route we're currently at, and then as soon as the new route is ready, we switch over to it. And if we try this with lots of slowdown, I have to reload here. To clear the cache, spend some waiting time. Waiting. And then press here. You can see that first with a pending state, then it transitions to the loading state, and now the data comes. And this is all controlled via this thing, the suspense timeout. We could set this to 5 seconds. We could set this to a minute if we wanted to. It's up to us. How long do we want people to, or how long do we want to wait for data to come in before potentially like missing or avoiding rather a loading state? And the thing you saw at the top here, the pending indicator, that's actually what this is. So as soon as a suspense transition, that's what that's called. Like when you press this button, the router will start via suspense, load the new screen as soon as it can. And whenever that's active, right away you'll get a chance of rendering something to indicate to the user that you're actually in a loading state, but you're not taking over the entire screen. Are there any like questions to start for that thing?
I have a question from in chat. Where in the view hierarchy is the pending component mounted? Is it overlaid on top?
Yes, exactly. So I'll show you. I'll just go ahead and put this in our fat fingered. Just put this out here in your index. I thought that was going to work. It doesn't because it's set index. Okay. Well, it's mounted just over the route mount itself. So the pending component, if we go to that, is just a div that's fixed to the top and then put in front of everything. So you could we could change this to render text instead, loading, for instance, or anything else that we want to, really. And that's nice because then we can use transition delays and animation delays to control how fast the pending indicator shows as well, if we want to do that as well. Yeah, so that's the first kind of thing that we'll do here. We'll make sure that if we, oh, sorry, we gotta have some slowdown here. It's not gonna be interesting. Make sure that all route navigations here now will be allowed to take 2 seconds before they show a loading indicator. So same goes here, same goes here, up to 2 seconds. There is, see that the request took a little bit longer, then we got a brief loading indicator here. And the point here that I want to emphasize is that you're in control of exactly how you want to handle this. So if you want this click to always show a loading indicator right away, you can configure that. If you want navigations to the tasks to have another delay, for instance, or another threshold for how long you're willing to wait, you can configure that. So it's all about like getting control over the UI to like match your individual cases you have in your UI for your UX. I've actually prepared, let's see here. I wonder what that is. So many components. Task list, perhaps, task for use. Yeah, so the thing I showed now was built into the router. The router is the thing that's kicking off the suspense transition, like it's called. I've made a small change here that'll allow me to just show you manually pair out kind of how this looks if you do this by yourself. So now with the newest recent React release, there's bindings to use transition, which is the API for concurrent mode and suspense that'll allow you to do these things. Like so a transition is just what you saw. Like when we're doing, you get a function here first, and when we invoke this function, anything we put in here will make React run that thing and then try and render that off screen and allow and set this flag to true, which is what we saw the pending thing before, and then wait for this amount before rendering either the suspense boundary or the content if it's finished. So if we start here, we set this to true instead.
We have another question.
Yes.
In the YouTube chat, it's Ulrich again. Does it make sense to have a shorter threshold of things that I know will take a long time?
That's a philosophical question. I'd say I don't know. It's kind of, I like that you can have a few seconds, for instance, as delay, just because you'll get a natural kind of new event, even though it's not a new event. You first have your pending indicator up here, and then nothing happens for a few seconds, and then you transition to a loading state down here. Like nothing new has happened. We're still waiting for things, but something has happened for the user. Kind of, they see that something new has happened on the screen. I think it's common to go the other way around. So things that you never want to show loading states for, that you set the threshold very high, like to a minute or something. But again, like it's all you can tailor it to your specific use case. So it's hard to kind of answer that as a general thing. I'd say it's more of a UX question, I guess. Like
yeah, exactly. That was my initial thought as well. This seems way more like a UX thing than, I mean, we as the developers, we have the tools to implement this, but it seems way more as a UX thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess you can see it all over the place when you're using something like Facebook. You have all these so-called skeleton frames and loading indicators, and it's just, I mean, we're on the web and we have to fetch everything to show it. It's not a native application. We have everything inside the computer, so we have to use these kind of tools to trick our users to believing things are instant or smooth while we're actually like fetching stuff from a server. So
exactly. So it's all about, like, usually when you start out with a new app, you have a pretty fast server, and people are using it on their computers with Ethernet and things like that. And then, like, it's so easy to forget that your UX is a sum of your UI and the network conditions and the server and the time of day, and like there's so many factors that goes into the experience of your app. I believe
it's more about like perceived performance and actual performance.
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah. So that's like a basic kind of thing. I never showed this, but never mind, it's the same as in the router. This is a basic kind of baseline for how Suspense works. So you start a transition from this hook. Whatever you run in here will be taken by React and rendered for, allowed to wait for this amount of time. And then you either get things either suspend, and you handle the suspension by showing a loading indicator, or you get the new content without an annoying kind of blink. And I think that's the, I'll show a bit more like in depth with the coordination of loading states here. But for me, one of the best things about Suspense and Concurrent Mode when I've been playing around with has been the fact that it's so easy to avoid jank and avoid flashes of loading indicators and or flashes of loading states rather. So like refetching something that you know is going to be at least kind of fast. It's so easy to just like, I have to have a loading state, but why have all of this complicated logic for like per component just to make sure that this renders after 500 milliseconds unless it's done, but then we got to cancel and we got to handle all the events ourselves, kind of. So it's really nice to have it at the framework level. I want to skip to a pretty interesting thing about Relay. So if we look at the structure of the application again, go back to main, we're rendering our router. And in this case, when we're on the dashboard, this thing will render the dashboard component. That looks like this. In ReasonRelay, you define your query kind of like this. And then we're using a lot of fragments here. We're spreading these fragments, and then we're calling something called use preloaded on this query. And this means that this query, whenever we get here, something else has had to start loading this query and pass the token down to this thing. So when we reach this code, this query will already have started loading. That's what we get in the router. And that's very important because of the things I've mentioned about code splitting and things like that. So in Relay and in ReasonRelay, you co-locate fragments with your components. So here's the revenue displayer. If I go back to the UI, this is this component over here. Oh, sorry, the entire thing. That defines that on the type statistics, I'm using another component called stats displayer, and I'm spreading its fragment. And that component in turn is using another component. This is going to be a lot of like one of those Russian dolls when you, it's just a new doll, how far you go. But this is showing the value, for instance. And this is then using another component. So you build up your UI by components defining what data they need in fragments, and then also what other components they want to render. And if we go back here, I'm sorry, this is going to be a bit abstract for now, but if we look at the revenue displayer, the only thing here that we know is that we want to render the revenue displayer. It's down here. We know that the revenue displayer needs data from the statistics type, which is on the top level statistics field. But we have no clue what that data is, or if it's requesting all of the data on statistics, or what data it's requesting. And this will then get turned into one big query that Relay will make and then give data to these various components. But the important thing here is to highlight is that this is opaque. So if I refactor this component, or if I extend it, or add a bunch of new things or remove things, this component, the dashboard that's giving the data to that component, doesn't need to know anything about it. So it helps to think of this as kind of the way you're composing your UI together with React. So you have components, they have props, and then they render something, but you don't know, like, you know what you're supposed to put in. You know there's props, and that's typed in a certain way, but you have no clue like what it's doing internally, or how it's going to render things. You just know it's going to render something, and if you give it these things. So the internals is kind of a black box, and it's the same idea here. So thinking about Relay, it helps to think about Relay as kind of the React for the data layer. So it's about, rather than building one big query where you explicitly select everything you need to render this view, it's about composing together components, just like you do in React. So the data dependencies for components. But what I want to do here, if we skip into the nav component, which is this bar up here, this has two points of data. It has this tasks counter, and it has the name and avatar of the logged in user. Those two things make it so that we have to request this data. We do it up here. It's two components with fragments as well. So this is making its own query. And then those two components are spread out in these trees. So here's one of them, the nav bar to do item count, which is this one. It's down here. And then the logged in user displayer is down here. So they are, of course, at different parts of the tree. But this means that we have to make this query here and then tunnel the data to these components down here. And this means that when we get here, this isn't a preloaded query. So when we get here, Relay is going to issue this query, start making it, and then suspend. So this is going to create a suspension event. And that's going to bubble upwards. As we saw, we're going to go come here into main. This is the nav. That's going to bubble upwards into index. And that's going to be caught by the general suspense boundary here. And that's what creates the effect of first having a huge loading indicator here, and then having the loading indicator down here. And that's not very nice, because there's so much content in here that we should be able to show. We shouldn't have to wait for all of this data to come back just to show this. For instance, this is static title. The entire menu is static except for the avatar and the counter here. And Relay allows us to do a pretty neat thing, which is that, sorry, if we go into here, like I said, we come down here to the query, this component renders, we come to query use. Query use is going to initiate this query. And then because it's initiating the query and the data isn't there, it's going to suspend, that's going to bubble upwards, and there's nothing above it that catches this. So we're going to catch it at the general boundary, the catch-all last point of defense, kind of. But with Suspense and Concurrent Mode, Relay will allow us to, instead of suspending at this place, suspend at the fragment level. So if we do this, oh, sorry, render policy equals partial, Relay will instead allow the suspension to kind of pass through here. We get to render all of this, and then we'll reach this component, the fragment, and we'll reach this component, and these two will emit a suspense event themselves. Now, if we go back here, nothing's going to change, because if I reload this, we're still going to see a huge loading indicator, because while we do get this far, and here's where the suspense starts, we're not doing anything with it. We still don't have a suspense boundary that's catching this. So what we can do, just to demonstrate how this works, is we can go to the outmost level here. So this div is catches that one, and then we can also take this div and catch those. That made a little shortcut here for wrapping in a suspense boundary. So we wrap those in a suspense boundary here. Just for the sake of it, if we go back here, now we can see that right away we get our bar instead. Still a bit janky, still a bit jumpy, but just by changing where the suspense event was emitted, or caught rather, we get to render all of this instead before, because Relay will let this through and then let each fragment suspend if it doesn't have data. And we can just, for the sake of it, we can go ahead and say, here we go. Yeah, and you can see, we see loading down here. So we've caught the suspense events, let it render even more, and then as data comes in, we're going to re-render again. And that's nice, but we can still do better. There's more here that we can render that doesn't have anything to do with the fragments. An important thing before I continue here is to, when I say that the render policy is partial, it's allowing, Relay is allowing you to skip through here, but we're still only making one query for this thing. These are two queries because one is for the dashboard and one is for the Nav Bar. So nothing changes with the actual query. The data request is issued in the same way, kind of. So if we go ahead and remove this suspense boundary, we're back to before. But now we can, instead of wrapping at the utmost level, we can wrap both components with a suspense boundary each. So if we start by wrapping this one, suspense boundary, we'll do that. Wrap this in suspense boundary, do that. Now if you go back, you'll see that we see much more of the content. Because again, what's happened is this component suspense, it bubbles up, but it's caught right away. So it doesn't affect anything else here. And the same goes here. This will suspend, but it bubbles up and it's caught here. And of course, now I'm just outputting empty things, so it will get somewhat of a jank anyway. But we could replace this with, for instance, let's see what I call this. Yeah, I prepared, like a good TV chef, I prepared a loading component for both of these. So we'll start with just this. We'll show a blank kind of avatar here instead. And then we'll go here. What did I call? No, right. Yeah, I don't care actually about doing a loading state here because it's so little data that it's fine that it's empty. But we've gone from suspending the entire thing and showing a loading indicator for the entire app to rendering as much as we possibly can, which is kind of nice and an improvement. And then, like, you may not agree that this is the best approach, but like the point is that you're in control. You can do these things, and you can design your tailor UI as you want in your UX. And the nice thing here is we can do the same thing for the other routes. So here, when we render this thing, we've rendered ourselves, the logged in user. And when we transition to this route, take a while, we see that actually we already have this data. This already exists in the store. Why can't we just show that right away? And we can. So if we go to the viewer profile, here's another query. This is also very typical for a typical approach for Relay. We have a top level field called logged in user that just returns the user that's logged in. And then we've divided this page into, we have a header here, then we have what do I call it? Yeah, description, and then a friends list. So these are distinct components that can be reused throughout the code base, which I'm going to show you also that they are. We know that usually when you, or like for this case, when we go to the user me route, which is the login user, we know that we're always going to have this data in the cache because we're always showing this thing. So we know this is going to exist. So what we can do is we can go in here into the use preload query. We can say that we want to have a render policy that's partial, which will allow Relay to let your things pass through, and then each fragment here will suspend instead. And like we did before, when we do this, sorry, we got to transition from a route to this for this to make sense. Start from here. When we do this the first time, nothing's going to change, because while we did allow Relay to continue into here, these are going to suspend, all of them. Not this one, because we have the data there, but these other are going to suspend. And we're not catching those events, so this thing is going to bubble up and reach the route suspense boundary. So we can do this. We can wrap these in a suspense boundary, and we can say that we want this to be a fancy Facebook content loader. Again, when we start out there, we're going to have to, sorry, this is going to be a bit repetitive because this only happens really when we're doing the transition to the new route. So if we now change to some slowdown, we can see that, oh, we get to render this right away because this already exists in the cache. So we're letting Relay transition to the route right away because the route is no longer blocking via suspense, because what's happening is Relay is letting this through. These will suspend, but we're catching them right away here. So the transition won't understand that there's no suspension going on here. We can transition right away to route. And there's a few things to say about how this is possible. One thing that is important to remember is that when you're telling Relay to partially render, you're telling Relay that it's okay to continue here. Don't suspend right away here, but rather let each fragment suspend only if they don't have data in the cache already. So what you're doing is you're allowing stale data, potentially stale data, to show here before, as you're waiting for the new request to come in, and then the data updates kind of. So if for some reason in some other on some other kind of device, I'd change my avatar here between loading this page and then clicking the route here, that new avatar would come in. I'd first see the old avatar because it's in the cache, and then I'd see the new avatar as the actual request came in here. Any questions about that? It's crystal clear.
Crystal clear.
Crystal clear.
It seems.
It seems. And this is again combining both concurrent mode and suspense, but also Relay with together to kind of give you this type of control. And we could, of course, also say that it's not acceptable. It's acceptable to wait for the friends list, but if we don't have data in the cache for both the header and the description, then we want to suspend anyway, because it's not acceptable to show the page without both the header and subscription kind of. So again, like, you're in control. You get to decide where you put the suspense boundaries. Do you want to catch both of these, or do you want to catch just one of them? you're in control kind of that. And the nicest thing about this is I've made no change whatsoever to any of these components internally. Like they're all the same. Like if I use this profile header in 10 other places and that requires another UX, it's all up to me. Like it's about composing together how the UI is allowed to change. So we can do the same thing when we go here. So this still loads slowly, but we again here we also know that whenever we see a friend list, we know that we'll at least have the avatar, and we'll also have the name. So if we go into the profile, user profile, we can do the same thing here, the user profile. This is going to look a bit weird if you're not used to Relay first. This is called the node interface, and this is a top-level field that can resolve any GraphQL type in your schema. I don't have that many, I have 2, so it's not that advanced. But using an ID, because in Relay, all IDs should be globally unique. And this is actually what's powering this whole thing, because Relay understands that if you're using the node interface and you have globally unique IDs, I can always look in the cache for this particular thing, because I know that IDs are globally unique. So if you're using this, if you're passing in an ID that exists on the user that you already have in the cache, I can just go ahead and return that, because that's always going to be the right thing. And if we go in here, and we're in this view, and we can go back here just to sure we're in this view, we can do the same thing here. We can go ahead and wrap these in a suspense boundary. Of course, now we won't have a login state because I just made an empty div, but we can, oh, sorry. All right, we got to set the render policy. Typing is hard, partial, like that. We go back here. Yeah, and we press this one, and it transitions right away. And then as the data comes in, it renders that. So that's a cool little thing to show more content earlier, kind of, if that's what you want to do. Like you can decide for yourself. Is this the right way for this particular route, or is it do you want to wait for all the data to come in, kind of? And this becomes more interesting. Like now we've done a few fairly, at least simple cases with avatars and names, and we can do the same thing for this, for instance, this task. If we go to this task view, remember that we have a title here, and then we have a priority. But this thing is also loading the avatar of the user, and then also the content down here. So doing the same trick for that is a little bit trickier, but can be done, because we know that we have these things. Usually when you show a list of tasks, you know that you're going to render the title, and usually you're going to render the priority badge. So we could do the same trick here. I'm not going to do that because yeah, it's going to take a little bit more time, and I have another thing I want to show you.
We have a question.
Yes.
What is the default render policy? Network first.
The default render policy is full, which means that don't render unless everything's there, all the data is there. You can set the default render policy app-wide if you want to, or you can do it per query, as I've shown here. So you could set render policy to partial if you want to for the entire app. But at least the things I've done, I've found that this is more of a thing that you want to do in some places where you have, like, you feel you have pretty strong guarantees around your data, kind of, and also you want to present something of value kind of quickly. So I think, like, going to this route, for instance, if we go back here and, all right, we didn't have that data. We'll go back here, slow down. And transition here. This is valuable to show right away because the avatar is a bit bigger and the name is also bigger, kind of. But if we just transition to this route and it'll look all the same, I don't think it's valuable to show that right away. I'd rather wait for more content to come in before actually showing that. And again, that's
update to the question. Sorry, meant fetch policy.
Oh, fetch policy, right. Okay, so fetch policy, for those who don't know, is how you instruct Relay of how it can use the data from the cache. And I think the default policy is store or network. So if the data is available in the cache, it'll render using that data. If it's not, it'll make a network request for the data. But there's a few other, you can also tell it to store and network, which means that if the data is available in the cache, it'll render using that data, but always make a request for updated data, for instance. So yeah, that's the. Any other questions before I have one final thing I want to cover here.
It looks good. We got a thumbs up. There's no more questions.
Cool. Okay, so the final thing I want to cover is another thing that's very experimental, very bleeding edge, and not at all merged anywhere. And it's the a new directive in GraphQL called defer. I'm sure you've heard of it, a lot of you. It's not stable yet in GraphQL JS, but hopefully it's going to be stable soon. Anyway, what defer is it's a way of telling your server that it's okay to deliver your query in increments, kind of. So if we go into this dashboard, here, you see we have a lot of data here. And all of this data is fetched in one single request. But like it might be okay for instance, task list and issues to just come whenever they're ready. It's okay to wait for them. We maybe don't have to have them at the like right away. So what you can do, like as soon as it's merged and not experimental, what you can do is you can add defer to a fragment. This, like, again, also your server will have to support this. I'm just showing that it's possible in Relay. So it's, and you have to change how you fetch things. So you fetch things in multi-part instead and things like that. So there's a few things. It's not going to be plug and play, this thing anytime soon, but it's a very cool kind of thing. For this demo, let's just say that it's okay if things just come in whenever they're ready. Let's say that we know that the underlying server here, it's making separate requests to other services, and we know that some of them are slow at times, like the task list is slow to get the times. New users is usually very fast, but can be slow during certain hours of the day. We can just say that let's just defer all fragments here, which means that you're instructing the server that just deliver these whenever they're ready, but you're still only making one request. So if nothing's going to change here because we're still, we haven't caught any suspensions here, but you see we're still making one request here. The other is for the Nav Bar, as I said before. But still, let's see if we can see this. I guess you see what I see. So that's a nav query. If we look at the preview here, you can see that things are coming in here now in multi-part instead. So first we get the total revenues coming in, then the to-do list, then the total users, issues, and so on. So these are actually delivered now in increments. So what we can do is, what happened here is this will, I think it's going to be actually automatically be partial as soon as you have the first somewhere, but I'm going to set this just because anyway. Relay is going to let things pass through here, and then we're going to reach this component, and this component is going to suspend until its data is ready. Same for all of these other components. So if we go ahead here and just wrap all of these in suspense boundaries, I've also, let's see here, I've prepared, where did I put this? I'm going to have to look for my, I've prepared a loading component for this, but I've forgotten what it's called and where it's at. So let's see here if we have. I'm going to have to look for this. Right, stats displayer.loader. Go ahead and do that. Again, nothing's going to change unless I wrap all of them, because this is not going to be caught by this, but all of the others are going to bubble up. So I'm going to have to do the same thing for all of the others. This is a pretty like contrived example, but it's just to, I'm going to show you a pretty neat suspense trick afterwards here. So this is very much for demonstrational purposes. Go ahead and wrap all of these. Here we go. Now when we reload, you see that these come in as they're ready instead. So they suspend, but the suspension is caught, and then they flicker in as soon as they're ready. And like I said, this is a pretty contrived example, but I've had a number of occasions where this would be such a huge help in the UI. And like stats is a pretty common theme there, like having a huge table with lots of stats, and the product manager and the UX people insist that you have to show everything at once. But it's just not feasible to fetch that amount of data in one go. So you want to be able to show more UI quickly. And in that case, you could defer the stats points kind of and still show something meaningful before. But yeah, so the point here, again, like we're looking at this, they show as they come in. And if we do even more slowdown here, you see that these will show as they come in. Exactly. Now this is nice, but it's a bit kind of jumpy. So maybe it doesn't make sense that anything but total revenue is the first thing that shows. And React actually ships with some utils to control this. So if we take all of these suspense boundaries and we wrap them in a suspense list, we can tell React that inside of this list, reveal all suspense items forwards instead of as they come in. So if we go back here and reload, you can see that things are only going to reveal as the top level items come in first. So we've told Relay that, and React that it's only okay to reveal other things here as soon as this has revealed. And then this must reveal before all this other can reveal. And the same for the others. So it kind of goes down. And you could also, I haven't really figured out when this is useful, but you can also do this backwards. So instead, we're going the other way. It's only okay to reveal things from the bottom and up. You have to do. I have a very fancy random generator for the delay, so you have to reload occasionally to get the desired effect. But you can see here, so it starts with the bottom one and then bubbles upwards. That's, I guess, what I wanted to show. Are there any questions or any other like thoughts or yeah, anything that's not me talking?
See, we have a chat here. Maybe worth mentioning all the code generation when using ReasonRelay, parenthesis compiler, and some of the naming conventions.
Yes. Face. Okay. So, and there's a ton of things to mention about Relay and ReasonRelay overall. Relay has a very strict naming convention. So if we go into the dashboard, for instance, I couldn't call this my query here because the compiler would say that, oh, you're not allowed to do that. All query names must start with the module name, which is the dashboard in this case, and end with query. So it's extremely strict, and all operation names, so all fragments, all queries, all mutations, and all subscriptions must be named globally unique. But that's not a problem in Reason because we already have that constraint. All modules already have to be named unique globally, which is nice because it's a big hurdle otherwise. Like most people, when they start using Relay in TypeScript and JavaScript, it takes a while for them to accept that somebody has decided how you're supposed to name things, kind of. I've worked in a code base that is, of course, nowhere near Facebook size, but still like decently sized. And the enforcement of unique names is so nice once things start to grow. It's so nice. It's so easy to search for things, and you're forced to name things kind of according to what they actually are. You don't have to look through scroll through 50 util.js files to find like the util for this particular thing you're in. But yes, exactly. And there's also another thing that was mentioned there as well. It really has a compiler, which you can see down here. I've tried to hide this as much as I can in this VS Code extension. So this VS Code extension will run the compiler for you, and then just tell you if there's errors and things like that. But yeah, really has a compiler which traverses your entire project, finds all of your graphical operations, validates them, and also cross-validates them. So it knows about your entire project. So we couldn't do, for instance, this thing. We couldn't use a fragment that doesn't exist, for instance. We also couldn't use a fragment if we tried to spread this on the root type instead. It'd say that we can't spread statistics on query, for instance, and things like that. So it's doing a lot of things. It's also generating runtime code for decoding responses. So it doesn't have to know anything about or very little about the schema and about your GraphQL server at runtime. It has generated that helpers for decoding things and traversing your responses at build time instead. Was that the answer?
It seems so.
Good.
Do you have any like inside information on what's happened? Because you're using Relay Experimental,
yes.
I'm guessing. Yeah, it's been sort of experimental for, I don't know, at least a year, I guess. We were at the meetup in October or November, I think, and you showed some Relay stuff. And we know that like Suspense and Concurrent Mode, they've encountered some delays and maybe are redoing some stuff, so it's taking more. Is it like blocked by the release of Suspense and Concurrent Mode, or?
So the way I've understood the Relay team is that the logical thing to do would be to wait until Suspense and Concurrent Mode is released before marking the Relay APIs that rely on them as stable. But I know that they've been inclined to possibly go for a stable release before React releases Suspense and Concurrent Mode. Because what I've showed here, I've used Concurrent Mode, I've used Suspense, but there's really very few things in the Relay APIs now that won't work at all without Concurrent Mode and without Suspense. So there's a basic version of Suspense in the React stable already. So if you want to use ReasonRelay without Concurrent Mode, you could do that. The only thing that's going to give you trouble is that you can't control the Suspense timeout, the delay before you show loading indicators, which will affect you if you're trying to do refetches, because that will suspend when you're doing refetches. Other than that, I think everything works in the stable version. It's just not as nice. You can't do all these tricks I've showed. Basically, that's the thing. But so as for the question of when they're going to be released, I think what's holding up Concurrent Mode and Suspense is probably a lot of figuring out for the broader community that isn't using Relay how to fetch data and provide primitives for that, because they've been doing a lot of, as I've understood, they've been doing a lot of the development of Concurrent Mode and Suspense together with the Relay team. So Relay is the only thing that exists that is fully integrated with Concurrent Mode and Suspense, or not the only thing that exists, but the major thing that exists that's like tailored to work with this, and that's been worked through both the kind of React and Relay teams. So long answer on a short question. I don't know really. Like, well, I hope fairly soon. And for ReasonRelay, I'm not going to make ReasonRelay stable before the underlying APIs are stable, but instead I'm taking this time to iterate on the APIs and the typing of things and stuff like that, and try and get this to be as nice as I can before marking things as stable and then locking down and not breaking stuff, basically. Because there's still a lot of iteration that needs to be done and a lot of around the typing that I need to revisit.
Yeah.
We have a question from the YouTube chat. How are errors handled? Componented cache?
Yes, exactly. So it's error boundaries all the way. So that's the way errors are handled for rendering components. So for fragments and for queries, mutations have their own like error callbacks, basically. So that's the.
Okay, cool. I think that's it, unless, oh, we got another thing in chat. You should also show the edit query option in the VS Code extension. Heart eyes emoji.
So I can do a very brief like just show the VS Code extension I've been working on here. So there's a lot of like there's a lot of rules to Relay, just as I've said around naming, but that's also good because that means that I can figure out how to name things when I generate things, like through the VS Code extension, for instance. So it's going to be pretty broken, but let's see here let's say here that we're in this component and we want to add another fragment component. We can select this, use code actions, I think they're called in VS Code, and then we can extract these to a new component. It'll give us a dialog that asks us what we want to call that component. Let's say that's display your value. And then let's say that we also want to remove this selection from this fragment. So that automatically inserted the fragment here, and it also created a new component here that has the thing I selected already set up and selected out using the use hook and kind of ready to go. So I'm working on a lot of those types of things to simplify extracting things into fragment components, because there's a lot of typing involved in that otherwise. There's also shortcuts, for instance, for adding a new fragment here. So we add a new fragment and it's gonna, let's say it's gonna be on the type task, and we get a new fragment module here with the task set up here. So we can just start selecting whatever we want. And we have this, I have the same operations for mutations and queries and subscriptions, basically. And then there's also a lot of things in Relay with, let's say, pagination, for instance. Pagination is pretty interesting because let's look at, we actually have pagination here. Isn't it friend list, I think has. It's friend list. Just gonna say goodbye to the compiler for now. So here's a fragment. And this fragment has a bunch of directives. And these are all like internal Relay directives. So this directive is saying that I want to be able to fetch this, refetch this fragment. So fetch new data for it. This is defining that this fragment can take arguments, that I can pass an argument of first and after, and what types and things they are. The reason that this is a thing is because there currently aren't any official support for passing variables into fragments. I think it might be somewhere, like I think it might be happening at some point. I think I've seen like an RFC for it, but currently Relay has re-implemented variables for fragments themselves. So this is the Relay compiler that takes care of all this. We're gonna end up covering a lot here, but there's also a concept called connections in Relay, and that is a structure for pagination. And this usually like scares people away because you're used to this not being weird edges and nodes here, but rather you have your offest, and you have your limit, for instance, limit, sorry. Like, don't think too much about connections now. Just know that connections is just a structure. It's just a structure for returning a response from the server that's paginating. Then you can choose how you want to deal with connections on the server side. But this connection directive is telling Relay that this thing here, friends, we're paginating this. So this fragment, like I said, it has a bunch of configuration through directives. But then when we go down and look how we use that, we're calling use pagination instead. And the user here will have a bunch of things. So it'll have the actual data that we requested. It'll have whether there's new more data to load. If it's currently loading more data, we'll let you load more data, like by just giving it a count. So I want to load 10 more items, for instance. So that's what we're doing down here. We're loading 5 more items. And this is really all it is. The actual, so a fragment is just a reusable selection. So a fragment by itself, damn it, can't be sent to the server. But since we've defined that this fragment is supposed to be refetchable, the relay compiler will generate a query for us. So if we look for this, the compiler has created a query for us here. This is the generated file from ReasonRelay, so please don't be too scared. But it's like Relay just takes care of generating a new query for us and wiring everything together. So if we look how this component is used, like normally when you're doing pagination, you'd have to have some form of, if you want to reuse the actual query you're having your fragment in, you'd want to have your arguments defined on the main query that uses this the first time. But if we look how this is used, let's see here, this friend list. You see, there's really nothing. We don't have to add anything here. It's again, like it's hiding all the implementation details. I have no clue that this thing is doing pagination. I just know that I want to render the user friends list component. That's all I know. I don't have to add anything here myself. This query looks like, yeah, it doesn't have anything in it. But the compiler, oh, right, sorry, I broke everything, I think, with something. What did I break? Or actually, oh, nice. Yeah, well, the compiler is gonna inline variables here, for instance, for us. So we're never gonna see that, but the compiler is gonna make sure that everything can get set up properly. So this is a thing with Relay where there's a very strong convention. You have to define these things. These things will have to be named in a certain way. You have to define this and name this key here a certain way. But as soon as you've done all of that, this is really all it is. Like you can now paginate with all of these built-in functions. You don't have to write any functions for merging the data back. You don't have to write the pagination query yourself. You don't have to think anything about this. Rather, you only think about like, I want to paginate the friends here. That's all I want to do. And the thing I was gonna come to eventually before blabbering is that if we remove all of these things, we now have no pagination. Sorry, we can even remove this. If we remove all of this, we have no pagination, but I've built into the extension, since everything is rule-based, you can run this and it sets up everything for you. Because these are rules, like this has to be called virtually this thing. I know it has to start with the module name, and since it's Reason, we know that the module name is globally unique. It's always the file name. I can use that to name this thing. I can set some form of sensible default here. I know that this is also bound by rules. It's the name of the fragment and then the path down to the fragment. So I can set everything up. And that's what I want to do with this extension. I want to make life with ReasonRelay be just as simple as I can, kind of. And it has a bunch of other things as well. Like you can, if we add this here, for instance, we can add a few directives. If I do this, include, oh, sorry, it's getting late here. Our URL, it should, let's see here. I hope this works. Yes, it can detect that you have a variable that's not in argument definitions, and it has to be because it's like props with React. You can add that, and it'll add the type of it and inline it into argument definitions. And I have a few other things as well, I think. VS Code suddenly got very slow for me. Maybe it's tired of me. What do I have more? Oh, sorry. So if I don't have any union here, but there's a few helpers for unions and things like that. So again, like if you're using ReasonRelay or interested in using ReasonRelay, I would love feedback on all of these things. And like, especially if you find things that are tedious or things that slow you down that can be fixed via extension, for instance.
Sorry, I have to interrupt. This is super cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm super happy we started. We just started adopting ReasonRelay.
Right, yeah.
Yep.
I spoke to your colleague, I remember.
Yep. And actually, well, my initial question, it was not to like put you on the spot, but I just meant the like edit, like the graphical view.
Oh, sorry. Right. Yeah. I can show that as well.
This is way better.
Let's see if that works. Like everything, edit it. No, I should have this in. Okay, just give me. Can Pontus play some like elevator music as I?
Why? Sorry, I haven't prepared that.
Okay, it's already installed. Crap. Let's see if I have this on editing. Sorry, I don't have it set up here.
There is a GIF, right?
Sorry.
I think you just need to enable it.
Oh, sorry, it wasn't enabled. Oh, that will help. Let's see here. Yes. Excellent. Okay. Yes, there we go. Thank you, whoever that was. So this will allow you to open this operation up in graphical instead, together with the Explorer. It's not as impressive when you only have 2 fields on the type. So we can go ahead and just close. Oh, sorry, it's the wrong place. It's also not it's not optimized for large fonts. I can see. Let me just put on the light here. So there we go. Let's find something that's more fun. Maybe a task, for instance. Let's take let's just take the dashboard view. So if we take this one and edit this in graphical, you get all of this, and you get the Explorer here, and you can select things if you want, and then you can persist it back to here. So it'll save everything down here. So the idea is to have kind of a complement where it's when you don't really know the graph, like because the autocomplete here is nice, but it's very much for when you already know your graph quite well. You know what you're looking for, kind of, because these are all like distinct types. So for me to know what's in here, I'd have to go one level down, and that's really what Graphical Explorer by OneGraph is helping with. If we go back here, you can see that we get this visual kind of menu where we can drop into, and we can look at the documentation at the same time, which I haven't really filled in, as we can see, but in theory. Yeah, so that's also a thing. Cool.
Okay, great. I think it's getting later. There's a lot of things we can show and continue with, but I think we need to stop, like put an end to it somewhere. We can continue. There's going to be more meetups, so don't be afraid. We'll do this again and continue. Do we have any more questions, or it seems like everyone has gotten their answers? The YouTube chat seems pretty calm. Well, if not, thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you.
The amazing presentation.
Without a single slide.
Who needs slides when you have code?
Yeah. So I guess like we'll wrap this up here, and then whoever wants to, I'll stick around for a little bit, and so whoever wants to hang around, just talk or something, just hang around here. And I think you can even, in Zoom, I think you can do like breakout rooms if people want to. Yeah, I don't know. I think you're supposed to be able to do that. I've never done that, so I'm not sure how it works.
Well, if I have the permission to leave, I'm going to do that. My girlfriend is sending like emojis with like people pointing at the watch and things, and and it's the first day of my vacation as well, and all this.
Yeah.
But it was great seeing all of you, and I hope you enjoyed the presentations, and thank you all for the presentations, Ulrik, Gabriel, and Kirill. It's really nice of you to take your time and prepare this and show us all what you've done and sharing this with us. And I hope we'll see more of you in the future, because this is not the last Reason Stockholm meetup, and we continue doing this probably remote since yeah. I mean, I prefer doing remote because it's easier to prepare, because I just have to sit here in my chair and do nothing. We don't need to find a space, and I think it's more fun to reach out to people all across the globe. So
yeah, I agree. I think it's much more accessible this way.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, people, feel free to stay here in the Zoom call. I'm gonna call it today, for me at least.
Yeah.
I'll talk to people later.
Yeah,
Take
thanks.
care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yep. Stop share. Here we go.
Gabriel, I forgot to ask, but do you have the same problem as the data loader tries to solve in Relay?
You mean that you're making you batch things together rather than?
So I think data load tries to solve two problems. One is the n+1 problem. I think it's kind of famous, and the other one is that you one is overfetching, and the other one is like you want to join or do it in the same time, kind of one query. You have the same problem with Relay.
If you mean on the client side, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, you could have. I mean, you're with Relay. You're kind of you're in control of how you want to build your queries. So I guess the common thing would be in a view, for instance, to just build a single query for the entire view, and that would mean that your server could leverage data loader, for instance, and you get everything in a single request pack. But you could also make separate queries that have overlapping data that return the same data, kind of, which would be redundant. I know you could have, for sure.
I also had another question, if you don't mind sharing the code again.
Yep.
I think just the one with the connection.
Yeah, we can share. Let's go back to the friends list here.
So I'm very just nitpicking now. Would it be possible to take all the stringy bits and hide them between like I don't know, like an abstract type or something like that?
Are you referring to these things, or?
Yes, yeah. So have those defined on or within the generated code as a field?
No, sadly not, because this is so this is just GraphQL, and this is what the compiler picks. Finds.
Right.
So this has to be here. I can't do any transformations in the current state, at least. That then ends up in for the compiler to read, kind of.
Yeah, I see. So this is like all valid, like Relay or GraphQL.
Yeah. So it's valid GraphQL that Relay can turn into valid Relay that I then turn into. I turn into Reason after that.
And I guess the compiler would also give you an error if you mistype something here, or?
Yeah, exactly. So we can just mistype things here.
All right.
If I, for instance, change this thing to just okay, I've broken something else. Yeah, exactly. Expect the key argument to be form of some name _ friends, blah blah blah. and the same goes for this thing. If I put this type here,
I mean, that's almost better like error message than reason.
Yeah, it's actually they're, I guess you've heard, but they're working on a proper language server integration from the Relay compiler into VS Code, for instance. They're rewriting the compiler is currently in Node, but they're rewriting it in Rust. And at the same time, they're enabling so that the compiler in watch mode can also act as a language server. And that's going to be, I think when that's finally ready, that's going to be really, really nice, because this thing I've kind of duct taped together here is a mishmash of various things that's never going to be as good. So for instance, here, it doesn't know that the fragment, this fragment exists, because the compiler knows it exists because it knows all the files in the project, but the GraphQL LSP, I haven't gotten that to work with all of the fragments. And even if I did, things wouldn't. So for instance, when we're using this fragment, in theory, it's possible for me to change that when I use this component in the viewer profile query, I want to show the first 10 users. It's possible for me to do this, but it's never going to be, unless I implement all of that logic inside of the GraphQL LSP, it's never going to be able to verify this. I'm always going to get an error here. But the Relay LSP will be able to verify all of that and provide autocomplete for all of the fragments and things like that. I think it's going to be really, really nice once it ships. A lot of things that needs to ship first. So it's also they've also the most recent release of Relay has added a few like directives that help you update the store, which are pretty cool. I don't have an example here to show just because I haven't made any mutations yet, but it's pretty nice. It'll help a lot with because updating the store manually is probably the thing with Relay that people struggle the most with, especially in Reason, because the Reason type system doesn't really lend itself well to the kind of imperative updates that you have to do on the Relay store.
I think that was probably the biggest, I don't know, scare or like challenge to understand, especially when you're like adding something with a connection as well.
Yeah. So the hopefully, as if we add a mutation here, let's add a task. Yes, let's add it in graphical. If I just select an edge back here, then just an ID. Sorry, let's move this. The idea here now is that when you have this thing, will I break now? Oh, sfdiv is still on that. Oh, it's gone. It's supposed to. Oh well, never mind. You have to bear with the squiggly lines. But the idea here is that when you return a new edge, you're supposed to be able to do this: prepend edge, and then send connections. And this thing will be a list of, I think it's ID, I can't remember. So you'll send a list of connections, and this will automatically prepend the edge into that connection. And then this looks weird because what the hell is a list of IDs here? Normally when you work with connections in the store, you have to provide a key and you have to provide filters and all that. But you can actually get the internal ID for the store for any connection by requesting __ID. __ID is always it's always going to give you back the cache ID for this particular thing. So it's almost always going to overlap with the ID of the thing. Oh, sorry, there's no ID on this thing. But for anything that doesn't have an ID, like a connection or an edge, for instance, you can use __ID, and that's and you can then take what you get there and feed that into the mutation I just showed, and it's going to automatically prepend that edge to that connection. And the nice part is that with that directive, it's going to be really easy to do optimistic updates with edges as well, because that directive will run even as you're returning an optimistic response as well, which means that like doing optimistic updates with adding things to edge to lists now or in connections, it's pretty messy. Like you have to create a local edge first and a local node, and in the store it's very like cumbersome. But this way you'd only have to provide an estimate of the server response, and it could take that and create the edge and then put that into the store.
Well, would this require any change to ReasonRelay or?
No, I just have to make it work with the latest version. I'm actually already. Let's see if we can see that. It's nice with Reason. I mean, you can do that in Flow as well. Flow has opaque types, but I don't think TypeScript has real opaque types. I can't remember, but it's nice with Reason because I can. So this thing is a specific thing. It's a data ID that goes to the cache, and I can type that as an abstract data ID type always underscore ID field, which means that that's going to be the only thing that you can pass into that particular thing. So it's like nice with the Reason that you have the abstract types also. But yeah, that won't require any changes to ReasonRelay other than making the latest version work, which I've already found a bug, so it's going to be a little while before it's a new version of Relay ships, I guess. So yeah. How far have you gotten at work with this?
So we have, I guess we have like two lists. So like a contacts list and a list of like chat messages with like a mutation to add messages.
All right.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, no fancy, suspense or concurrent stuff.
No concurrent mode.
No.
Yeah.
I guess we can always add that later on as well.
Yeah.
To enhance.
I guess it's also like a fairly big mind shift to get into that frame of mind. Just doing thinking in that way instead of the old way, so to speak. Okay, so I think I'm going to have to go to sleep as well here. But it was nice of you to come, and thank you for all the good questions.
More than welcome. I'm also leaving. But,
yeah. So I'll speak to you later. Thank you everyone for joining tonight. See you soon.